I now call the honourable member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's fascinating to sit in the chamber and listen to the Assistant Treasurer talk about how the Labor Party is the party of hope. It's fascinating to stay in the chamber and hear about how the Labor Party espouses a policy that looks to the future with confidence, that recognises that our best days lay ahead of us. And you'd think, Mr Deputy Speaker, that if you actually took on board what the Assistant Treasurer had to say, that maybe the Labor Party offered the people of Australia some real alternatives. But the reality is that, consistent with Labor Party policy, every step of every day when it comes to swapping their positions on policy, what we heard from the Assistant Treasurer today was yet another example of saying one thing but doing something completely the opposite. And I turn my mind, Mr Deputy Speaker, to an article that was published in The Australian earlier this year, the 26th of March actually, that contained the most recent speaking points from the Labor Party organisation that went to every backbencher and every frontbencher on the Labor Party side. And these were some of their talking points. Let's call them the talking points of hope. Let's call them the talking points of not making sure the Australian people are fearful, but rather the Australian people are inspired. Let's look at some of the gems that they had that inspired the Australian people. Talking points like, without action on climate change, average temperatures across Australia could increase by between 2.2 degrees and 5 degrees by 2080. People in northern New South Wales will feel like they live in Cairns. Without action on climate change, the average snow season in Australia is expected to contract by between 85% and 96% by 2050 and disappear by the end of the century. No more snow in Australia, Mr Deputy Speaker. But that's not politics of fear. That's the politics of hope and inspiration. Without action on climate change, it's expected to reduce the value of irrigated agricultural production in the Murray-Darling Basin by 12% in 2030 and by 49% by 2050. And temperature rises and population growth mean the number of heat-related deaths in our capital cities is expected to more than triple to between 4,300 and 6,300 a year by 2050. What a great message of hope, Mr Deputy Speaker. What a great message of inspiration for the Australian people. No, the Assistant Treasurer is right. The Labor Party isn't in a scare campaign. They're about a vision for the future. Well, what rubbish. What absolute rubbish. And that's the reason why the Australian people look upon the Labor Party and look upon the Assistant Treasurer as complete and utter frauds. Because they are frauds, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the same way that the Assistant Treasurer comes into this chamber and dares to lecture the coalition about engaging in the politics of hope, but then blesses and condones talking points like that. That's the reason why we will stand up to the Labor Party. That's the reason why we will reject every step of the way their ridiculous policy to make this country less competitive and importantly, Mr Deputy Speaker, a policy that will do nothing to change the global environment and to change the global temperature. But importantly as well, though, Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a government that entirely consistently, every day since they were first elected in 2007, has chopped and changed when it comes to policy. Now let's cast our mind back to the 2007 election. Everyone remember the hype about the Kevin 07 campaign. And there used to be videos, and there was YouTube advertisements, and there were television advertisements where we saw a very earnest-looking member for Griffith who'd put his hands together and say, "Are you concerned about the cost of living? Well, so am I." And what we saw from the member for Griffith as part of that campaign was a resolute promise by the member for Griffith on behalf of everyone in the Labor Party to do something about the cost of living. And the tagline that the Labor Party used, and it's on YouTube, I'd encourage people to have a look at it if you want to kill a minute of your life, the tagline that was used by the Australian Labor Party was, "If the economy is doing so well, why aren't we?" And that was 4 years ago, Mr Deputy Speaker. 4 years ago that the Labor Party campaigned about doing something on the cost of living. And who could remember the centrepiece of their policies? Fuel Watch, to bring down the price of fuel. Grocery Watch, to bring down the price of groceries. And what have we found over the last 4 years, Mr Deputy Speaker? We've seen that the Labor Party has forgotten all about the cost of living. They've completely forgotten about it, and in the same way they've forgotten about the member for Griffith, Mr Deputy Speaker, because they turned their back on Grocery Watch, they turned their back on Fuel Watch, And we had instead a Deputy Prime Minister who actually rose up after promising that it was more likely that she'd be a full forward for the Western Bulldogs, and then only a matter of hours later, Mr Deputy Speaker, actually slit the throat of the member for Griffith and took over the leadership of the Australian Labor Party. And what we know as well, that's right, there was no stunning beforehand, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was a very savage killing. It perhaps was even worse practice than some of the worst examples we've seen over the past couple of months. But that notwithstanding, Mr Deputy Speaker, we saw with this new Prime Minister once again this resolute earnestness as the new Prime Minister stood there and wrung her hands and said, "I've got a great idea for the future. We'll have a People's Congress on climate change. We'll get the best and the brightest in the country with visions of 2020 haunting us still. We'll get the best people in the country together and we'll develop a People's Congress on how to deal with climate change." But oops, we've heard nothing about it since the election. We had the Prime Minister stand and say there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead 6 days out from the federal election. Oops, the Labor Party's turned their back on that as well. We had the Prime Minister stand up and say, "I can stop the boats, and I'll do it by getting a regional solution in East Timor." That then transferred to become a regional solution in Papua New Guinea, and that's now become, of course, a regional solution in Malaysia. They've turned their back every step of the way, every single day, on the policies that they put forward. And that's the reason why, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Australian people look at the Prime Minister and look at the Australian Labor Party and say, "We have no confidence in your ability to lead. We've got no confidence in what you say. We have no confidence in the direction in which you're going because, frankly, you're going around in circles. And we've no confidence whatsoever in your ability to take Australia forward with confidence into the future." And that's the reason why, Mr Deputy Speaker, there is a crisis of confidence in this country when it comes to the direction and the policies of the Australian Labor Party. This is the worst Labor government that this country has seen, I would say, since before Whitlam. This is the worst Labor Party that the Australian people have been inflicted with, in conjunction with, of course, the Greens, because this is a government that stands for nothing and that believes in nothing. This is a government whose policies, in the one hand, claim to be full of promise, but then when we see leaked copies of the talking point, are actually all about neglect and about fear and about scaremongering and about doing what they can to make sure that they berate the Australian people in trying to back their policies. But the reality is, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Australian people know all about this government. They've got their measure, they've got their mark. They know that this Prime Minister is a complete fraud when it comes to the policies and the words that she utters. And that's the reason why, when it comes to this policy, they also know that Labor's great big new carbon tax will do nothing to make our environment better. When questions have been put to the Australian Labor Party, Mr Deputy Speaker, about if the parliament was to roll over and accept every single policy proposal that the Labor Party put forward, what impact would that have on Australia's environment? How quickly would that make a difference to saving the reef or saving the rainforest? And of course we get no answers from the Australian Labor Party. We get no answers, Mr Deputy Speaker, because we only contribute 1.5% of global emissions. So even if we were to jeopardise our economic future by adopting this ridiculous new carbon tax that the Labor Party is implementing, it will do nothing to change the global climate, and that in turn will do nothing to make sure that, like Labor's talking points, that there are fewer bushfires, fewer droughts, less floods and better and more fertile land, Mr Deputy Speaker. And that is precisely the reason why people laugh now when the Australian Labor Party claims to be sincere. We saw less than 24 hours ago the Treasurer of this country claim that Australia would be taxing, through the carbon tax, up to, their quote, up to 1,000 companies, and then try to justify the inclusion of those words "up to" as in some way demonstrating that the fact that it's now been halved is all okay. In the same way, Mr Deputy Speaker, we could say that Australia's debt level under the Labor Party is now up to $200 billion. Sure, it might be $107 billion, Mr Deputy Speaker, but it's near enough. The reality is that this Treasurer has no idea about where the policy direction of this country is going, and the reason is because the Prime Minister herself has no idea about the policy direction of this government. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Australian people rightly, although there might be a little bit more money splashing around, and that has very little to do with the economic management of this government, it's because of China, although there might be a little bit more money splashing around the Australian economy than there is elsewhere, there is no confidence in this government. no confidence in the policies of this government, no confidence in the direction of this Prime Minister, and fundamentally no confidence in the Australian Labor Party to do anything to help lead this country to a better future.